back. But this time I'm going to do something a little different. I've decided to go over my PlayStation 2 collection, since I think I actually have a pretty good collection by now. But instead of going through the games one by one like everyone else, I thought it'd be more interesting to go over my collection by genre. And since it's the month of October, I thought it'd be fitting to go over my survival horror section, which is definitely one of my favorite genres ever. I mean, I definitely think it's an underappreciated genre now, but back in the day it used to be really popular, so a lot of good survival horror games were made back then. And I definitely have a lot of them for the PlayStation 2, so yep, I got plenty to work with. So, with that being said, let's get started. First game, Clock Tower 3. The thing about Clock Tower 3 is that Clock Tower 3 is almost nothing like the first two games. In fact, the first two games are point and click, but not this game. This game controls like any other survival horror game at the time did, except I don't think this game has tank controls. So it's definitely quite different from the original two games, but even so, I thought the game was pretty decent for what it is. I mean, if you can find this game for cheap, I think it's definitely worth picking up if you consider yourself a big fan of the genre. But to Clock Tower fans, I think they consider this to be the black sheep of the series, so definitely not the best entry to start off with. But like I said, if you can find it for cheap, it's worth checking out. Next up, Fatal Frame. Also on Xbox. The thing about Fatal Frame is this game was very original when it came out. I mean, there really weren't any survival horror games quite like it. Mainly because of, its features. And if you haven't played Fatal Frame, before, I'll give you a quick rundown. Basically, you spend the entire game with a camera, and basically you go around, taking pictures of ghosts, which might seem kind of boring, but it's actually really fun and definitely quite tense at times. I mean, and not all the ghosts in the game are actually out to hurt you either. A lot of them would just like you'll just see in the distance, or they'll be like near you, or just be following you, but they're not necessarily there to hurt you. They're just there to scare you, or try to tell you something, which I thought was actually pretty cool. Not to say all the ghosts are not threatening. It's definitely not a bunch of Caspers walking around, but some of them will definitely hurt you and definitely intend to end your life. But also worth mentioning is that this game is considered to be based on a true story, but that's not technically true. I mean, at the very best, this game is very loosely based on a true story. Apparently, this game is actually based on one of the creator's dreams, or a series of them, which I thought was actually pretty interesting. But like I said, this game was definitely unique for its time. And I think it definitely stands pretty tall among some of the best survival horror games. So if you consider yourself a fan of the genre, you owe it to yourself to check out Fatal Frame, at least the first game. Next up, Fatal Frame 2. So Fatal Frame 2 was actually a prequel to the first game. So you don't have to play the first game to play this one, but I would recommend playing the first game anyways, and then play this one, just because they're a little bit different, but not too much, and just because they're both worth playing. And unlike the first game, you actually have someone with you. It's not to say it's an escort mission, but you actually play as a twin sister, and your other twin sister follows you around through the majority of the game. And she'll often tell you when she saw a ghost around, or when she's got bad feelings. So she'll give you hints when it's not safe to be in the area. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But many people consider this to be the best in the series, mainly because a lot of people consider it scarier than the first game. So it's like I said, it's definitely worth checking out. But there's also a remake of this game on the Wii, but unfortunately that wasn't released in the U.S., which is a real shame because I hear it's actually really good. But even so, this is still worth checking out. It's also on Xbox too. That's worth mentioning. And so is the first game, which I think it's on Xbox as the director's cut. So I think the Xbox version is actually better than this one. But I don't have the Xbox version, and I think it's actually harder to find than the PlayStation 2 versions. But yeah, that's Fatal Frame 2 for you. Definitely one of the best. Sorry about that. My camera ran out of memory. But what was I talking about? Oh yeah, that's right. Fatal Frame 3. At least I was starting to talk about this game. Fatal Frame 3 I actually haven't played yet, and which is why my copy is still sealed. Although I think I'm gonna buy another copy of Fatal Frame 3 so I don't have to open up this one. I also have Fatal Frame 2 sealed as well. But I do want to play this game though, since I like the first two games. But I have heard Fatal Frame 3 is actually not as good as the second game. But I don't know for sure since I haven't played the game myself. But apparently there's more downtime in this game. You actually spend more time in the house in between missions and levels. So the game definitely has a slower pace than the other games apparently. Which I can see why they wouldn't like as much as the second game. But even so, I still think it's worth checking out. And unlike the first two games, this Fatal Frame 3 is only on PlayStation 2. And this was actually the last Fatal Frame game to be released in the US before Fatal Frame 5 recently. Because Nintendo actually got the rights to Fatal Frame. But Fatal Frame 4 and the Fatal Frame 2 remake on Wii, like I mentioned earlier, were not released in the US for some reason, which this is a real shame. So it wasn't until Fatal Frame 5 recently that we've been able to play Fatal Frame series again. But it's digital only over here, unfortunately, so they really cheaped out on that one. But hopefully they do release the other games over here in the US in some kind of form. But even so, the Fatal Frame series, like I said, is one of the best. I definitely think it stands really well. It stands up really well to other survival horror games, and like I said, it's a must-play series. Next up, Haunting Ground. The thing about Haunting Ground is this was apparently going to be the next Clock Tower game, but they decided to make it its own thing because they thought it would sell better. I don't know. But I do think this game is better than Clock Tower 3 though. And it does play pretty similar to that game, but in this game you actually have a dog, which is actually pretty unique since there really aren't many, if at all, any survival horror games where you have a dog companion with you. The only other game I can think of that has a dog with you is Rule of Rose, which is actually pretty rare and expensive PS2 game, unfortunately, which is actually another game I want to pick up, but like I said, it's pretty rare and expensive, so I'm probably not going to be able to play that game anytime soon. And also, Haunting Ground is actually kind of one of those more rare PS2 games also. Definitely not as rare as games like Rule of Rose, but it's definitely up there. And definitely more expensive than most PS2 games, unfortunately, so this game's definitely not worth the asking price, but if you can find the game for a reasonable price, definitely pick it up. So yeah, Haunting Ground. Actually thought it was a pretty cool game for what it is. I actually really enjoyed the game despite how rare and expensive the game is now. So yeah, pick it up if you find it for a reasonable price. Next up, Kuan. Kuan is also another one of those more rare PS2 games, more rare and expensive PS2 games, I should say, except I think this one's even more so than Haunting Ground, unfortunately. And it's made by From Software, who are best known for making Dark Souls. And they also actually made another survival horror game for PlayStation 2 called Echo Night Beyond, which plays in first person, but I don't have that game and I haven't played it, so I can't really say much about it. But Kuan is actually pretty unique also as a survival horror game. It actually takes place in ancient China or Japan. I'm actually not sure, to be honest. But it definitely takes place in a different time period than most survival horror games, that's for sure. And, unlike most games where you use guns or ammunition or whatever to fight off enemies, you actually use magic. So already there's some elements from, Dark Souls that are in this game. But, like I said, of Haunting Ground, though, I'd say only pick up this game if you can find it for a reasonable price. It's definitely not worth the asking price. And I haven't beaten this game, but from what I've played so far, I think it's actually a pretty cool hidden gem of a game. But unfortunately, like I said, the game's pretty rare and expensive, so only pick this up if you can find it for a reasonable price. Next up, Resident Evil Code Veronica X. So Code Veronica was originally exclusive to PlayStation 2. Sega Dreamcast, but as we all know, the Dreamcast bit the dust fairly quickly. So this was ported over to PlayStation 2 and actually got remastered not too long ago in HD for the 360 and PlayStation 3. So that's worth checking out. But the thing about Code Veronica, though, is it's often considered a spin-off, but it's actually not. This is actually Resident Evil 3, or it was originally supposed to be Resident Evil 3, but Capcom kind of at the last minute gave it the subtitle Code Veronica because they actually had a deal with Sony to make 3 numbered Resident Evil games for the PlayStation. So that's the reason why, this is called Code Veronica, and we got the Resident Evil 3 which recycled a lot of assets from Resident Evil 2 and is pretty similar to that game, except he plays Jill Valentine. But most Resident Evil fans actually consider this to be one of the harder games in the series. So, take that into consideration when playing this game. I don't know if I would actually agree with everyone else on this game being one of the harder entries in the series, but I will say it can be easy to get save trapped in this game, so definitely, save on multiple files. I made that mistake the first time I played through this game, so yeah, that's never fun. And also, you not only play as Claire from Resident Evil 2 in this game, but you also play as Chris Redfield in the second half of the game. So this was before Chris started taking steroids and punching boulders. But with that being said, though, Code Veronica I think is actually a pretty underappreciated game in the series. I think it's definitely better than most people make it out to be. Although this game does have a really dumb character named Steve, who is everyone's favorite Resident Evil character, by the way. No, he's not. He's one of the worst. What's Steve? I would describe Steve as basically like a whiny Canadian Leonardo DiCaprio ripoff, which I actually thought was really really funny. So I actually kind of like Steve in that way because he made me laugh. But the game does have its flaws, but I think it is a worthy sequel in the series and definitely underrated entry in the series in my opinion. Oh, that's funny. It says Resident Evil 5th Anniversary Edition, even though the series is 20 years old at this point, which is just crazy to think about, that Resident Evil was actually the same age as me. So, yeah. Next up, Resident Evil Dead Aim. Resident Evil Dead Aim, I actually consider Resident Evil Dead Aim to be a rough draft of Resident Evil 4, mainly because of the behind-the-back perspective. But this game is definitely not quite like Resident Evil 4 gameplay-wise. This game actually uses a gun con. You can use a controller, but it's definitely better to play this game with a gun con. It's definitely more fun to play. And it's considered to be part of the Gun Survivor series, which was basically a series of Resident Evil games that used the gun con. But Dead Aim is definitely not the most memorable entry in the series or the best, in my opinion. So it's definitely, one of the weaker entries in the series, I'd say. But if you consider yourself a big fan of the